Hello, I'm Sherry Trimble, Museum Educator at the State Museum of Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us for Learn at Lunchtime. This session has been pre-recorded in order for our staff to get ready for the opening of our new exhibit, A Place for All, Three Stories of Integration in Pennsylvania, opening on July 17th, 2022. If you have any questions, please use the email at the bottom of the screen. This presentation features Beth Hager, Director of the State Museum, and Dr. Kurt Miner, Senior Curator of History, as they discuss the history behind this exhibit.
Kurt, thank you for joining us today to talk about the new exhibit that we're opening in June 2022, A Place for All, Three Stories of Integration in Pennsylvania. This exhibit has a history already of its own, history of the history exhibit. Can you fill us in on how the genesis of this exhibit?
Yeah, these A Place for All, again, as your subtitle indicates, three stories of integration in Pennsylvania. These stories have been repackaged in this new integrated exhibit, but they originally appeared here at the State Museum back in the early 2000s, and they were curated by our late colleague, Eric Liddell Smith, who was a specialist in African American history. And they were introduced as part of a kind of informal series exploring the history of the civil rights movement in Pennsylvania after World War II, and presented over the course of, I think, 3 years. So we are, for this exhibition, we decided to simply build on those same three stories because we think they have kind of new relevance now, given more recent events in this country and in this state. And we thought it was an opportunity to kind of provide perspective on what we believe is a much broader struggle for racial justice, and in this case specifically for in the early civil rights movement, the focus on integration.
Well, and we both were at the museum 20 years ago when these were out. And I never felt like they really got their due.
Yeah.
And even though, they were up and they were appreciated, it just seemed like great content. It was greatly curated, and that this was a chance to pull them back together in an even stronger presentation. Now,
back in 2002, we developed an exhibit which I curated on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the opening of Levittown, which was a brand name post-war suburb, the second of its kind built in the United States. It's located in Bucks County. For that exhibit, we focused on the development of Levittown and how it was received by the people who moved there. But we thought there was a big part of that story that we couldn't tell in the main exhibit that deserved its own telling, which was the story of the racial integration of Levittown in 1957. And Eric Liddell Smith spearheaded the effort to tell that story, which we presented in conjunction with that exhibition. And I thought it was interesting because as I've revisited that story and the other two stories that we tell in this exhibit, I'm reminded of the energy we had in telling those stories, because it's a story that's often told in the American South, and it's thought to be a story that takes place in cities like Birmingham, Alabama, Greensboro, North Carolina, Little Rock, Arkansas. Yes, those were places where the civil rights movement really saw some significant changes and events taking place. But what's interesting is there was a parallel track in the North that's often overlooked. And again, the Levittown story, which we often refer to as the Daisy Myers story, because Daisy Myers was, she and her husband had been the couple with their 3 small children who effectively broke the color line in Levittown in 1957. it kind of opened up a whole other way of looking at what's often still regarded as a Southern issue or a Southern problem of which is that this kind of informal caste system that kept African Americans kind of relegated to second-class citizens. What we found in re-exploring these stories is that when you think of the South, a lot of these clearly segregated spheres of life were reinforced with laws. African Americans, if you think of the classic example, could only drink from the colored water fountain. It didn't happen like that in the North, but there was very strong racial separation. It was reinforced not by law so much as by custom and practice. That doesn't mean that the lines that were any less severely drawn. In fact, they were. So that's what this exhibit tells of 3 places where beginning in the late 1940s, there was a very sharp demarcation between whites and African Americans, and how and why that ended up changing in the 2 decades after World War II.
Pennsylvania, above the Mason-Dixon line, certainly does not get a pass on this this epic in American history. So you mentioned the Daisy Meyer story, and that's how the new exhibit, the combined exhibit, starts out. And it starts out kind of in an intimate way of presenting you essentially into their living room and facing the challenges that they did. One of the things about that display, I mean, there's incredible photographs because I think you mentioned it was a national story, and Daisy Myers and her family ended up in Look magazine. It was very much in the public eye at that time. The first Black family moving into Levittown. We have some incredible film footage that I was not in the original exhibit, but you knew about, and we've since found it. And it's people talking about the Myers moving into their neighborhood at that time, actual neighbors. And it is riveting to hear what was said. I mean, it was pro and con, and people were very forthright about what they were saying. And it's stunning to hear that, and to imagine that people would say that some of these things into a camera at that time, but it just shows you how prevalent this thinking was at the time, and what they were facing.
Yep. And I think what I'm again reminded of as we were kind of reassembling these and bringing in new sources and revisiting old ones is the power of the firsthand accounts. In each of these 3 stories, we end up in the exhibition, perhaps even more so than in the original set of exhibits, focusing on these change agents who really took it upon themselves to solve the problem, and they were not going to wait for the state to step in. The state was kind of following behind. It was very much a kind of grassroots movement to overturn these last barriers to integration in as it turns out, in housing, in public accommodations, and specifically in the case of our exhibition, public swimming pools, in particular in Pittsburgh. And then finally in education, including private schools. And we focus specifically on a school in Philadelphia, which was a residential school that was funded by an 19th century philanthropist, but with a racially restrictive admissions policy that held up for decades until 1965, when there was a concerted effort to desegregate Girard College. And that's the final story that we focus on.
And so, as you mentioned, very grassroots protests for 7 months straight of African Americans of all ages coming out and protesting every single day at that school during that time. It's amazing.
So it's these so these are these end up grabbing headlines, and they end up becoming, for the moment, national stories, competing with and running parallel to these other more well-known national stories. But I think what makes this powerful is that we have these personal accounts. Daisy Myers writes a book. It keeps notes, keeps a diary as she and her family attempt to move into this, what they thought was simply going to be a nice little ranch house where they would provide them with more room for their three small children. And it ends up being the site of a, mob demonstrations that go on for very mobs assembling outside their house for 2 solid weeks, harassment that goes on for weeks and then months. It requires the governor of Pennsylvania to call out the state police, interestingly enough, at the same time that the governor in Arkansas is calling out the National Guard to deal with their issue, which was the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. It's interesting, though, the divide where the state calls out the their National Guard, their state National Guard in Arkansas to help maintain segregation, to prevent the students from entering that high school. At the same time, Pennsylvania's governor calls out the state police to ensure the safety of the Myers family. And so it's a different outcome. So it's quite interesting to see how this mix of these personal stories, these national headlines, and it's all, when you pull it together, all rather compelling. And I think it sheds a light on this chapter of the civil rights movement that does not get the same attention because of it's, as you say, above the Mason-Dixon line. It's interesting that when you kind of put all three of these together, it will surprise people that racial separation persisted as long as it did in these areas, because it's for instance, in many other parts of Pennsylvania, many other places in the 1950s, there was no legally enforced segregation, but there were just a lot of ingrained habits and practices. So for instance, it's interesting to think that even though public parks were integrated, there was not a African American park in Pittsburgh or a white park in Pittsburgh. Where the struggle to integrate the pools took place was in a well-integrated public park, but the pools themselves were racially separated as late as 1951. I mean, that's kind of shocking, and it wasn't enforced again through a sign or a law. It was just the practice, and there was a lot of opposition when in that particular case, a then young pastor named Leroy Patrick decided to take it upon himself to enter the pool with a group of youth from his church and withstand the taunts, withstand the harassment, and exercise their right to swim in the same pool that white people swam in. And to think that it was that late that was still happening is rather surprising to me.
In the 20 years that's passed since these exhibits were first researched and presented, I know that you and other staff and consultants have gone back in to see if there were new materials that could be gleaned. What were some of the things that we're presenting now that we maybe didn't have access to or didn't know about, or have come about since 2002?
Well, one of the things I thought was really interesting is that we were able to get our hands on a full treasure trove of photographs that were taken by a fellow who's been fortunately getting his due, as he was a photographer for the Black-owned newspaper in Pittsburgh called the Pittsburgh Courier. His name was Charles Teeny Harris, and it was interesting because the Teenie Harris was employed by the newspaper to cover events that were important to the African American community in the 1940s and 1950s. The mainstream press did not pay attention really very much to what was happening at Highland Park Pool in 1951 and 1952. Very few, if any, photographs of that exist in the mainstream press. So the Pittsburgh Courier, on the other hand, this was big news. They saw this was a really important story to cover because they were trying to, again, break this color barrier that prevented them from exercising their right to use these pools. So we were able to tap into these photographs that have been very carefully preserved now by one of our partner organizations, the Carnegie Museum of Art. And if it were not for Teenie Harris's work and the preservation effort by the Carnegie, we wouldn't be able to tell that story the way we are able to tell it now, and are able to use it through those wonderful photographs taken by Teenie Harris.
They are terrific photographs, and Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania is so fortunate to have that resource, because a lot of cities would not have that.
That's
and
right.
Kudos for them for preserving them. Obviously, kudos to Teenie Harris himself for that documentation.
And the other thing I think I will add too is, I think visitors who I hope will come to see this exhibit, because of these first person accounts, these original source materials, and I think frankly the way we've pulled this and designed this exhibit, it's a sense that you are there. We are immersing people in these environments, in these places where change was happening and change was occurring. I think it's very, very effective in terms of getting that across to people.
The photographs and the way they're presented, it's very evocative, and very, great use of, well, we think so, of just getting to the personal. You are there, it just confronts you. It's very powerful.
Yes.
Not only is there really riveting, if you will, footage in the Levittown section about the Myers, related to the Myers family, the Girard section has some new footage in it as well. Kurt, you want to describe that a bit?
Yeah, we were able to procure this television news footage of pretty much kind of the high point in the Girard College integration campaign, and occurred in August of 1965. By this time, the pickets had been in place in front of Girard College since May, and there was really this kind of groundswell of support, and it was again attracting a lot of attention. This is a school that was located in the center of North Philadelphia, by then a predominantly African American community, surrounded by a 10-foot wall, 43-acre campus, lily white inside. Not surprising that became a point of contention, and in Philadelphia and in the Black community, rightfully so. And that protest attracted national attention and drew Martin Luther King Jr. to Philadelphia, who came there on August 3rd, 1965, to lend his moral support to this cause. And just wonderful footage of King addressing the throngs who had, again, these supporters who were, day in and day out protesting and trying to bring attention to this, and trying to get the city of Philadelphia and the trustees of Girard to reverse course and do the right thing. And it becomes a really interesting point in the civil rights movement in Pennsylvania, where it's a convergence of Martin Luther King Jr., who you don't think of as crossing into Pennsylvania much, but boy, there he was in this big rally that got a lot of it. So that's really a very powerful moment.
It is. It also features Cecil B. Moore, the lawyer who was really the leader
of
the whole integration efforts in with Girard College.
That's right.
That footage was provided to us by KYW CBS 3 in Philadelphia, who graciously permitted us to use the footage, which is housed and maintained at Temple University's archives in Philadelphia. Again, you know, a great testament to the great archives and preservation of our history that we find throughout Pennsylvania.
That's true.
And it's
Absolutely.
always great. And then to get to access these sources to tell these stories, really important.
Yep.
As you mentioned, Dr. Patrick, he was on our commission, the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, when this exhibit came out. He has passed on. Daisy Myers, who's actually looking over your shoulder with one of those beautiful Look magazine photographs in your office. She was at the opening of the original small exhibit 20 years ago. She has passed on. Her husband had predeceased her. And two of the brothers who were admitted into Girard College were here for the exhibit when it opened. One of them has recently passed on. So again, even more important for us to be telling these stories and sharing that and relating it. You know, there's a lot of interest, fortunately and happily, in African-American history and where all this has come from, and really evaluating things. And it's so important to share this material now.
Absolutely.
We find it relevant, incredibly relevant, and really a testament to the resilience. And that's we say a story of resilience. I'm going to forget these subtitles in the exhibit. You know them well, but they're strong, brave stories that we're thankful to Eric for bringing them, working with us years ago to do the first uncovering. Grateful to you and our staff for working on this and bringing it to light. It's an exhibit that it opens June 17th, but we'll be keeping it up for several years. As we look to the future of the State Museum, we really need to tell more of these personal stories about people. And as the State Museum renovates and reevaluates its exhibits, this is kind of one of an early step toward that. Thank you very much for your work on this. I salute the staff and our partners on creating this exhibit.
Thank you.